Thank you so much, Martin, coming from Vienna, telling us about the situation in the EU. And now, from France, but working in Portugal, you will tell us, Juliette, about the nature protection in the European seas. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And indeed, I'm going to take you through a little bit of the how and the why we are not protecting our seas in the European Union. But first, let's talk a bit about marine biodiversity. We are lucky to have a rich marine biodiversity in our European seas. As you can see here, some habitats and species. I don't have a pointer, so you'll have to guess which one is the polychaete worm. And all of these species and habitats have effects on their ecosystems, and they're also very important for us. Through biological and physical processes, they shape our coasts, they participate in producing oxygen, and we extract food from marine biodiversity. But also these seas are also used and inhabited by many humans. In the EU alone, there are 22 coastal states, so that's a lot of people and a lot of maritime activities. Here you can see the combined effect of human activities on marine biodiversity, the redder, the greater, the negative impacts. So what activities are we actually talking about? Many of them. Shipping, wind farms, fishing, aquaculture, large tourism, etc. And we also need to talk about our terrestrial activities affecting marine life, including through pollution, plastic pollution, nutrient pollution. But all of our activities actually affect the range of climate change through greenhouse gas emission, and this is impacting the ocean a lot. It affects the range of climate change, so at sea it means the range of ocean warming, ocean deoxygenation, ocean acidification, the intensity of heat waves, and the frequency of these waves. And biodiversity cannot escape these drastic and fast changes. And we are already observing the consequences of our activities. Here you have a map of the species and habitats we could assess, and you can see that it's already also quite orange and red, showing poor or bad status of marine biodiversity. And there's also the question of, what about us? How are we going to cope with marine biodiversity loss and changes in these ecosystems that we rely on? So we developed many policies to reduce impacts of activities. At sea, we cannot really do a lot of restoration. It's complicated and very costly. And as we just talked about on land, we developed protected areas, marine protected areas at sea, or MPAs, with the idea of using this space to reduce human activities through regulation, sensitization, or changes in practices overall. So just a little bit of policy background first. We talked about many other policies. At sea, there are two that I want you to remember about. First, the common fishery policy. It gives a lot of competence for fisheries at the European level. And there's also the Natura 2000 network that we've heard of. It requires states to designate protected areas under this umbrella, and it also requires states to implement conservation measures in them. And then there are other measures, policies, but remember these two. And also you need to know that at sea, the different policies don't apply the same way everywhere in the ocean. We divided our seas in in national territories. So each national territory that you can see mapped here is divided in 3 jurisdictions. Nearshore waters, territorial sea, and then you have the economic exclusive zone that can go up to 400 kilometers square. Kilometers. But as you can see, them mapped here, it depends on the state and how close the neighbors are. And in these national territories, I'm not talking about the high seas, just national territories, states designated protected areas, marine protected areas that you can see mapped here. There are now more than 4,800 of them in European seas, and you can see them mapped here. They cover up to 11% of EU waters. And as we just talked about on land, you can see that except for some large ones, they're small and they're coastal. They are located in territorial waters. There are many types of MPA, so they can be designated under national law or as Natura 2000, as we just talked about. These areas are designated for specific ecological features, specific species or habitats, and overall we know very little about them. Can I make it this one? Yes. So we, for example, didn't have an assessment, just as for land, of their effects, their consequences, and actually what they're used for, what activities they regulate. And so we cannot assess the consequences on ecosystems and also on human communities. So that's what my research focused on. But at EU level, we have actually very little data on information about activities and their impacts, except for general index. So I focused on mapping regulations in MPAs. Can we mine? Can we fish? And I then summarized all of these regulations using protection levels for these MPAs. Protection levels classify MPAs based on these 7 activities, their occurrence, and the range of the scale of impact that you can see in red. So it classifies MPAs from fully protected. As you can see, there's only low impact allowed, highly protected, lightly protected, and minimally protected, where large impacts are allowed. And if mining or industrial activities are allowed, the MPA would be classified as incompatible with conservation objectives. Again, at EU scale, we don't have information about the scale of impacts, even sometimes at national level. So here we focused on regulations, and then if we knew that an activity was allowed, we took the lowest impact it could have, so we're really underestimating impacts and overestimating protection levels. This is what it looks like. You have the MPA coverage at the scale of all EU waters. It doesn't mean that nothing is happening in the white space. It's just that I'm focusing on the MPA area. And you can see on the plot and on the map, it's mostly dark green. It means that most of the MPA area is minimally protected. So it means that impactful, highly impactful fishing gears are allowed, or activities like dredging. You can also see differences between countries. In Denmark, it's mostly light protection, but in other places, like the Netherlands, it's mostly incompatibility with conservation objectives. Now, if you look at fully and highly protected, the blue, well, actually, you don't really see it, because at the scale of EU waters, it's really small. You can try to spot them on the map. We described about 500 of them, and as you can see, they are very small, and they are coastal. They are in territorial waters, and that's where the jurisdiction thing is important. Because in the EU, we have the common fishery policy, so it means that to restrict fisheries activities in their economic exclusive zone, fishing activities of EU fleet, states have to negotiate these restrictions at the EU level. So, as you can see here, most of the fishery restrictions in MPAs and outside of MPAs are located in territorial waters. So that means that there's really less protection for offshore waters and deep sea habitats. Just to specify, this is only based on regulation, so then it needs to be enforced and controlled, and many EU MPAs do not have the means to do that. So overall, we found that EU MPAs really provide little regulations from highly impactful activities. But actually, if you look at the EU legal framework, it makes sense. EU environmental policies exist, but they're very flexible, and they don't have specific requirements in terms of regulations and in terms of protection levels. They're also contradicted by many other policies that encourage economic development, or like the common fishery policy that makes it difficult to reduce impacts by restricting activities. European MPAs are also made for this. If you look at the goals of Natura 2000 network, for example, they're meant as non-exclusive of human activities, and often for many of these EU MPAs, they're made for and by economic actors. I also want to point out that we still found regulations in MPAs. They're not all incompatible, right? And there are lots of people working to make these spaces places of conservation and environmental democracy and education. It's not all about regulations. But it's clear that there's a mismatch between what actors want, what we think MPAs are doing, and what protection they actually provide. And this mismatch needs to be addressed. MPA policies are becoming increasingly important in Europe. Stakeholders are being building coalitions, NGOs are going to court for failure in implementing EU policies, the Natura 2000 network. And the Commission also clearly expressed its will to move forward more stray protection, as we talked about. It's also happening at sea. And there's also the non-legally binding action plan, which calls on member states to phase out mobile bottom fishing gears from MPAs. Overall, same as we've just seen on land, states are very late in defining their commitments towards these objectives, and they also have all a different definition of what strict protection should be. But I hope you now have a better idea of what it actually takes to dedicate MPAs to conservation and to reduce impacts of activities, including fishing, in these MPAs. It takes negotiating at EU level and in Denmark, for example, at national level as well. So it takes suspense. It takes collaboration. Research have shown that successful, highly and fully protected MPAs have been designed and managed with local communities and with various actors. Research have also shown that participatory processes in European protected areas are really lagging behind. Without any improvement in these processes, restrictions will have to be taken, but conflicts will only rise. And this takes money, funding, time, and facilitation. But if the goal is to use our marine protected areas to protect and restore marine ecosystems, we need to address these conflicts, and we need to decide what we're going to do with our maritime activities. Tack.
Thank you. Thank you.